My name is Robert Maxwell, but everyone here calls me Bob. I'm 83 years old, sitting in the common room of Sunset Gardens Aged Care in Perth, Western Australia, watching the afternoon light filter through dusty windows. The other residents think I'm writing my memoirs, but that's not quite right. This is more of a confession, I suppose. A reckoning with choices I made decades ago that still echo through these empty days like thunder after lightning has already struck. I was a proud man once. Proud of my faith, proud of my position in the congregation, proud of the way people looked at our family when we walked into the Kingdom Hall every Tuesday and Thursday night, and twice on Sundays. The Maxwell family was what every Jehovah's Witness family should aspire to be, or so I thought. Margaret, my wife, walked a step behind me in her modest dresses, her head covered appropriately, never speaking unless spoken to during meetings. Our 3 children, Sarah, Michael, and little Emma, sat perfectly still during those 2-hour sessions, their hands folded, their eyes forward, absorbing every word about paradise and Armageddon and the narrow path to salvation. What I didn't see then, what I refused to see, was how tightly I was holding the reins. How my grip on righteousness was strangling the very people I thought I was saving. It started when Sarah turned 7, and I caught her humming a Christmas carol she'd learned at school. The rage that filled me was swift and terrible. Christmas was a pagan holiday, I reminded her as I made her stand in the corner for an hour. We don't celebrate Satan's festivals in this house. She cried quietly, trying not to make any sound that might anger me further, and Margaret just watched from the kitchen doorway, her face pale and resigned. That should have been my first warning. The look in my wife's eyes that day, the way she seemed to shrink a little more each time I enforced what I called discipline and what I now understand was control. But I was 28 years old, recently appointed as a ministerial servant in our congregation, and the weight of responsibility felt sacred on my shoulders. I had a direct line to Jehovah's truth, and my family's eternal salvation depended on my unwavering commitment to his ways. The birthdays were the hardest. Every September, Sarah would watch through our living room window as her school friends celebrated with cake and balloons and silly party hats. I found her there once, pressed against the glass, tears streaming down her 8-year-old face as she watched her best friend unwrap presents in the yard across the street. When I asked her what she was doing, she whispered that she just wanted to know what it felt like to be special for one day. I should have pulled her into my arms then. I should have explained that she was special every day, that our love for her didn't need a calendar date to prove it. Instead, I reminded her that such celebrations were selfish and prideful, that true Christians found their worth in service to Jehovah, not in worldly recognition. She nodded obediently, but something in her eyes dimmed that day. I told myself it was spiritual maturity. Now I know it was the first crack in our relationship. Michael was different from his sisters, more rebellious by nature, and that made him a particular project for me. He was 10 when I found comic books hidden under his mattress, stories full of superheroes and violence and magic. I made him burn them in the backyard while I watched, explaining that such material was demonized, that it would open his mind to Satan's influence. He stood there stoically as the pages curled and blackened, but I saw his hands tremble. "You're protecting him," Margaret said that night as we lay in bed, her voice so quiet I almost missed it. "From spiritual contamination," I replied firmly. "It's my responsibility as head of this household." She was quiet for a long time before she spoke again. "Sometimes I wonder if we're protecting them from life itself." Her words troubled me more than I cared to admit, but I pushed the doubt away. The world was corrupt, full of temptation and false promises. My children would thank me someday when they inherited eternal life while others perished in Armageddon. I was building their character, preparing them for paradise. When I was appointed as an elder at 32, my sense of divine purpose intensified. I had studied every publication the Watchtower Society had ever printed, could recite scripture with the fluency of a trained minister, and I delivered talks at our circuit assemblies that moved grown men to tears. The congregation looked to me for guidance, for wisdom, for an example of what faithful Christian living looked like. And our family was that example, perfectly controlled and spiritually pristine. But perfection is a prison, though I didn't understand that then. Sarah was 14 when she asked me why she couldn't go to her school's career day. "It's just to learn about different jobs," she said, hovering in the doorway of my study where I was preparing for a meeting with the other elders. Mrs. Henderson said there would be nurses and teachers and even a veterinarian. I didn't even look up from my notes. Higher education leads to pride and materialism. You know this, Sarah. A woman's role is to support her husband and raise children in the truth. Why would you need to learn about worldly careers? She stood there for a moment, and I could feel her wanting to argue, could sense the questions burning behind her lips. But she'd learned long ago that questioning my decisions was questioning Jehovah himself, and that was not permitted in our home. She whispered, "Yes, Dad," and closed the door softly behind her. I found out later that she had been at the top of her science class, that her teacher had specifically recommended her for the advanced biology program. Margaret told me this years afterward, during one of our last conversations before she got sick. She wanted to be a doctor, Margaret said, her voice heavy with regret. She used to hide medical textbooks under her bed and read them with a flashlight after you thought she was asleep. The weight of that revelation still sits in my chest like a stone. Michael's rebellion became more open as he grew older. I found him listening to rock music when he was 15, the Devil's soundtrack playing through headphones he'd bought with money from an after-school job I'd reluctantly allowed him to keep. The job itself was acceptable, cleaning at a local business, honest work, but the independence it gave him was becoming a problem. "This music is corrupting your mind," I told him as I threw the CD player into the garbage. "The lyrics are filled with sexual immorality and violence." "It's just music, Dad," he said, and there was something new in his voice. Defiance. "It's not going to turn me into a devil worshipper." "Don't mock what you don't understand," I snapped. "Everything we allow into our minds shapes who we become. Would you drink poisoned water because it tasted good?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. "Maybe I'm already poisoned then," he said quietly. "Maybe I've been poisoned by fear my whole life." I should have heard the pain in those words. Instead, I heard only disrespect, and I grounded him for 2 weeks. No job, no school activities, nothing but Bible study and meditation on his attitude. He endured the punishment in silence, but he started looking at me differently after that. Like I was a stranger who happened to live in his house. Emma was the baby, 6 years younger than Michael, and I was gentler with her in some ways. She was easier to manage, naturally quiet and studious, content to read the Bible stories I gave her and draw pictures of paradise where lions played with lambs. But even Emma began to chafe under the restrictions as she grew older. She was 12 when she asked if she could take art classes at school. "They have an after-school program," she said hopefully. "The teacher said I have real talent." Art was acceptable, I reasoned. There was nothing inherently worldly about drawing or painting, as long as the subject matter was appropriate. But when I visited the school to examine the program, I discovered it included figure drawing, abstract expression, and something the teacher called exploring personal truth through creative expression. "Personal truth is dangerous," I explained to Emma that evening. "Truth isn't personal. Truth is absolute, found only in God's Word. Art should glorify Jehovah, not express selfish desires or worldly philosophy." She cried that night. I could hear her through the thin walls of our small house, muffled sobs that cut through my certainty like a knife. Margaret went to comfort her, and later, in our bedroom, she turned to me with tears in her own eyes. "They're children, Robert," she whispered. "They're supposed to explore, to discover who they are. We're taking that away from them." "We're protecting their souls," I replied, but the words felt heavier than they used to. The cracks in our family became chasms as the children entered their teenage years. Sarah grew more withdrawn, spending hours alone in her room reading the few books I deemed appropriate. Michael became increasingly argumentative during family Bible studies, asking questions that bordered on apostasy. Why couldn't we verify the teachings independently? Why weren't we allowed to research other religious perspectives? Why did questioning make us disloyal to God? I shut down those conversations quickly, sometimes harshly. Questioning the organization was questioning God himself, and I wouldn't tolerate such rebellion under my roof. But the questions didn't stop, they just went underground, whispered between siblings when they thought I couldn't hear. Emma began having nightmares about Armageddon, waking up screaming about fireballs and dead bodies and being separated from her friends forever. Margaret wanted to seek counseling for her, but I refused. Worldly psychology was incompatible with biblical truth. Instead, I prescribed more Bible study, more prayer, more faith that Jehovah would comfort her fears. Looking back now, I can see how we were all slowly drowning. Margaret grew thinner, more anxious, jumping at unexpected sounds and apologizing for things that didn't require apologies. The children moved through our house like ghosts, careful not to disturb the peace I'd created through rigid control. Our dinner conversations became exercises in approved topics only, discussions of Bible stories and congregation news, and the approaching paradise that sometimes felt more like a threat than a promise. Sarah was 17 when she told me she didn't want to be baptized. I had been expecting this moment, preparing for it during her teenage years, ready to guide her to the proper decision. Baptism was the most important step a young person could take, a public commitment to Jehovah that would secure her place in the new system. "I'm not ready," she said, sitting across from me at our kitchen table while Margaret prepared dinner with unusual intensity, her knife hitting the cutting board with sharp, rhythmic precision. "Ready is a choice," I told her. "You've been studying the truth your entire life. You know what's required. But what if I don't believe all of it?" The words tumbled out of her in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for years. "What if some of the teachings don't make sense to me? What if I think good people shouldn't die just because they're not Jehovah's Witnesses?" The kitchen went silent except for the sound of Margaret's knife, which had stopped moving entirely. I felt that familiar surge of anger, but beneath it was something new. Fear. Not fear of divine judgment, but fear that I was losing my daughter. "Those doubts come from Satan," I said firmly. "He plants questions in our minds to lead us away from truth. You need to pray harder, study more, spend time with spiritually strong young people in the congregation." "What if they come from thinking?" Sarah asked, her voice stronger now. "What if they come from using the mind that you say God gave me?" I slammed my hand on the table, making both Sarah and Margaret jump. "Don't twist Scripture to justify rebellion. The heart is more treacherous than anything else and is desperate. Who can know it?" Jeremiah 17 verse 9. We cannot trust our own thinking when it contradicts God's clear direction. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something die in her eyes. That spark of hope, of possibility, that I'd been systematically extinguishing for years finally went out. "Yes, Dad," she said quietly. "You're right. I'll pray harder." But she didn't get baptized that year, or the next. And when she turned 18, she moved out of our house and into a small apartment across town. She said she needed space to think, to figure things out, but I knew what was really happening. She was leaving the truth, and by extension, she was leaving us. Michael followed his sister's path 2 years later, though his exit was more explosive. He came home from a circuit assembly where I delivered a particularly stern talk about the dangers of worldly association, and he was visibly agitated. "Do you ever listen to yourself?" he asked me as we sat in our living room, the tension thick enough to cut. "Do you hear how angry you sound when you talk about love?" "I speak with conviction," I replied. "The truth requires boldness." "The truth," he repeated, and there was something bitter in his voice. "Whose truth, Dad? The organization's truth? Your truth? Or actual truth?" I stood up, my hands trembling with rage and something deeper. "The truth is God's truth, revealed through His faithful organization. If you can't see that, then Satan has already gotten his hooks in you." Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Satan. Always Satan. Never the possibility that you might be wrong. Never the chance that maybe, just maybe, love shouldn't require this much fear." He left that night, packing a single bag and walking out our front door without looking back. I stood at the window and watched him disappear into the darkness, and part of me wanted to run after him, to pull him back, to find some way to make this right. But pride held me in place. Pride and the certainty that I was protecting our family's eternal future, even if it meant sacrificing our present happiness. Margaret began to change after the older children left. She grew quieter, more distant, spending hours staring out windows or sitting in our garden with her Bible open but not reading. I found her crying one afternoon when I came home early from a meeting with the other elders. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "I miss them," she whispered. "I miss our children." "They made their choice," I said, sitting beside her on our porch swing. "We can't force them to stay in the truth." "Can't we?" Her voice was so soft I had to lean closer to hear her. "Or did we force them to leave it?" The question hung between us like a physical presence, heavy and uncomfortable. I wanted to dismiss it, to explain again how we'd done everything according to Scripture, how their leaving was proof of their spiritual weakness, not our failure. But looking at Margaret's face, seeing the grief etched there like lines carved by years of held tears, I found I couldn't speak at all. Emma was still at home then, 16 and caught between her parents' growing despair and her own conflicted feelings about faith and family. She tried to bridge the gaps, calling her siblings regularly, reporting back to us about their lives in careful, edited versions that wouldn't cause more pain. Sarah was working at a medical clinic and taking night classes. Michael had found a job in construction and was dating a girl from work. They were surviving, even thriving in some ways, but they rarely came around anymore. When they did visit, the conversations were strained and formal. We'd gather around our dinner table like actors playing roles we'd long since grown tired of, discussing safe topics like weather and work while avoiding anything that might spark the old arguments. I could see the love still there in their eyes when they looked at Margaret and Emma, but when their gazes met mine, there was something else. Not quite hatred, but a kind of tired disappointment that cut deeper than anger would have. Emma finally graduated high school and surprised all of us by announcing she wanted to attend university. Not for anything worldly, she insisted. She wanted to study social work, to help families in crisis, to use her faith as a foundation for serving others. It sounded reasonable, even noble, but higher education was strongly discouraged in our congregation. The elders and I had given many talks about the spiritual dangers of universities, the way they promoted evolutionary theory and moral relativism and independent thinking. "You don't need a degree to serve Jehovah," I told her during one of our increasingly frequent arguments. "The preaching work is the most important career any Christian can pursue." "But what if this is how I want to serve him?" Emma asked, and there was a pleading quality in her voice that reminded me painfully of Sarah at the same age. "What if helping broken families is my calling?" Calling. I repeated the word like it tasted bitter. We don't follow personal callings. We follow the direction of God's organization. If you want to help people, there are opportunities within the congregation, within the theocratic system. Emma tried to compromise. She enrolled in community college instead of a 4-year university, studying part-time while increasing her hours in field service. But even that modest step toward independence seemed to create more distance between us. She began asking questions during our family Bible studies, not rebellious questions like Michael's had been, but thoughtful ones that showed she was thinking beyond the boundaries I'd established. Margaret's health began to decline when Emma was 19. At first, it seemed like stress and exhaustion. She'd lost weight, seemed tired all the time, complained of headaches that wouldn't go away. I encouraged her to pray more, to trust in Jehovah's healing power, to avoid the worldly medical system unless absolutely necessary. But when she started having trouble keeping food down, even I couldn't deny that something was seriously wrong. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. Stage 3 ovarian cancer, the doctor said, his voice gentle but direct. Treatable, but aggressive treatment would be necessary. Chemotherapy, surgery, possibly radiation. Margaret sat beside me in the sterile hospital room, holding my hand as the world tilted on its axis. That night, I called Sarah and Michael for the first time in months. Emma had been keeping them updated on our family news, but this felt like something I needed to say myself. Sarah answered on the second ring, her voice cautious but warm. "Dad, is everything okay?" "It's your mother," I said, and suddenly found myself unable to continue. The words stuck in my throat like broken glass. "What about Mom?" Her voice sharpened with concern. "She's sick. Very sick. Cancer." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "I'll be there tomorrow." Michael's response was similar, though he asked more questions about treatment options and doctors' recommendations. For all his rebellion against our faith, he'd inherited my tendency toward practical problem-solving. Emma cried when I told her, deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to contain all the grief our family had been holding back for years. The next few months brought our fractured family back together in ways I hadn't expected. Sarah took a leave of absence from her job to help care for Margaret during chemotherapy. Michael drove her to appointments when I couldn't get away from my elder responsibilities. Emma coordinated medications and dietary needs with the efficiency of a trained nurse. It was during those long days in hospital waiting rooms that I began to see my children as the adults they'd become. Sarah had developed a quiet competence and compassion that served her well in medical environments. Michael's natural leadership abilities, which I'd once tried to channel into theocratic service, had made him successful in his secular career. Emma combined intelligence with empathy in ways that made her a natural counselor for anyone facing crisis. They were good people. Not perfect according to the standards I'd tried to impose on them, but genuinely good in ways that mattered. They treated their mother's nurses with respect, showed patience with elderly patients in the oncology ward, and supported each other through the difficult days with a maturity that humbled me. Watching them navigate this crisis, I began to wonder if maybe Margaret's quiet doubts over the years had been wiser than my loud certainties. Margaret fought the cancer with courage and grace, but the treatments were brutal. She lost her hair, lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, spent days too weak to get out of bed. Through it all, she maintained a gentleness that seemed to flow outward, touching everyone who cared for her. The hospital staff loved her. Her chemotherapy companions looked forward to her appointments because she remembered their names, asked about their families, brought small gifts on their difficult days. I tried to use her illness as an opportunity to bring the children back to the truth. During one of Sarah's visits, I suggested that this trial might be Jehovah's way of drawing our family closer together, of helping the children see what really mattered in life. Maybe, Sarah said carefully, arranging flowers Emma had brought from Margaret's garden. Or maybe it's just cancer. Sometimes terrible things happen without having a spiritual lesson attached. Her words troubled me, but I was beginning to understand that troubling thoughts weren't always wrong thoughts. I spent more time reading scripture during those months, not the systematic study I'd always practiced, but a more searching kind of reading. I found myself drawn to passages about love and mercy, about forgiveness and second chances, about the weight of religious burden versus the lightness of grace. Margaret died on a rainy Thursday morning in March, holding my hand while Sarah stroked her hair and Michael sat at the foot of her bed reading from Psalms. Emma was getting coffee in the hospital cafeteria and missed her final moments by less than 10 minutes, a fact that haunted her for months afterward. Her last words were quiet and directed at all of us. Take care of each other. The funeral was the hardest thing I'd ever endured. Margaret had been my partner for over 30 years, the steady presence that had balanced my intensity, the soft voice that had whispered caution when my righteousness threatened to overwhelm my compassion. But even harder than losing her was watching our children grieve while maintaining the careful distance they'd learned was necessary for family peace. I delivered her eulogy, speaking about her faithfulness and dedication, her quiet service to Jehovah and her devotion to our family. The words felt true but incomplete, missing something essential about who she'd really been. It was Sarah who captured her better in the brief remarks she gave at the gathering afterward, talking about Margaret's garden and her kindness to strangers and the way she'd made their childhoods feel safe even when the world outside their home felt dangerous and uncertain. After the funeral, our tentative reconnection began to dissolve. Sarah returned to her life across town. Michael went back to his job and his girlfriend. Emma threw herself into her studies with an intensity that worried me. I was alone in the house Margaret and I had shared for 25 years, surrounded by reminders of our life together and the family we'd built and somehow lost along the way. I tried to maintain my responsibilities as an elder, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. The meetings felt hollow, the talks I'd once delivered with passion now seemed repetitive and somehow beside the point. I found myself wondering about the questions my children had asked over the years, the doubts I'd dismissed as spiritual weakness. What if they'd been seeing something I'd been too proud or too frightened to acknowledge? The final blow came 2 years after Margaret's death, during a routine visit from the circuit overseer. He'd heard about my spiritual struggles from other elders who'd noticed my decreased enthusiasm for judicial committees and disfellowshipping decisions. During our private meeting, he was direct about his concerns. "Brother Maxwell," he said, his voice carrying the authority I'd once respected without question, "there are reports that you've been questioning some of our organizational procedures, that you've expressed doubts about certain policies. "I've been grieving my wife," I replied carefully. Sometimes grief makes us ask difficult questions. But we don't question the faithful slave, do we? We trust in Jehovah's organization even when we don't understand. Especially when we don't understand. I sat in my study, looking at this man who'd once been a mentor and friend, and realized I couldn't give him the assurance he was seeking. What if the organization isn't always right? I asked quietly. What if some of our policies have caused unnecessary harm to families like mine? The silence that followed was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold with disappointment. "I think you need to seriously examine your heart, Brother Maxwell. This kind of thinking is dangerous, not just for you but for the congregation that looks to you for leadership." I knew what was coming before he said it. I was asked to step down as an elder, to take time for spiritual reflection and adjustment. The announcement was made the following week, carefully worded to avoid specifics but clear enough that everyone understood I'd been found wanting in some fundamental way. After 40 years of faithful service, I was suddenly on the outside looking in. The isolation was complete then. My former friends in the congregation treated me with a careful politeness reserved for those who might be spiritually contagious. The younger elders avoided me entirely, while the older ones watched me with sad eyes that seemed to say they'd expected better. And my children, seeing my fall from grace, pulled back even further, uncertain how to relate to a father who was no longer the spiritual authority they'd both feared and respected. Emma finished her degree and moved to Melbourne for graduate school. Sarah got married to a man I'd never met, a kind doctor who treated her with the gentle respect she'd never learned to expect from the men in her life. Michael started his own business and began traveling frequently, always too busy for more than occasional phone calls. They sent cards on my birthday and flowers on the anniversary of Margaret's death, but their lives moved forward without me in ways that felt both inevitable and devastating. I spent the next 15 years rattling around in an increasingly empty house, going through the motions of faithful service while feeling more disconnected from purpose with each passing day. I attended meetings sporadically, participated in field service when pressed, but my heart was elsewhere. I was searching for something I couldn't name, something that felt more real than the certainties I'd built my life around. My health began to fail when I was 78. First my knees, making it difficult to navigate our two-story house. Then my heart, requiring medication and regular monitoring. Finally, a small stroke that left me with slurred speech and weakness on my left side. Emma flew in from Melbourne to help me sort through my options, her professional training in social work making her the natural choice for managing my transition to assisted living. We spent 3 difficult days going through 50 years of accumulated possessions, deciding what was worth keeping and what could be donated or discarded. The hardest part was finding boxes of the children's artwork and school projects that Margaret had saved despite my periodic attempts to declutter. Emma cried when she found her old drawings, the ones that had shown such promise before I'd discouraged her artistic pursuits. "Why did you keep these?" she asked, holding up a crayon picture she'd drawn when she was 8. "Your mother kept them," I said. I wanted to throw them away, but she hid them in the attic. Emma looked at me with something between sadness and anger. She knew they were important, even if you didn't. The move to Sunset Gardens was the final admission that my independent life was over. Emma helped me settle into my small room, arranging my few remaining possessions with the same careful attention she'd given to Margaret's care during her illness. She stayed for 3 days, making sure I understood the routines and knew how to call for help when I needed it. On her last night, we sat in the facility's garden watching the sunset paint the Perth skyline in shades of orange and gold. For the first time in years, we talked about something besides my health or her work or the weather. "Do you ever think about Sarah and Michael?" she asked. "Every day," I admitted. "I wonder how they're doing, what their lives look like now. Sarah must be, 52 now? And Michael is 50. Hard to believe." "Sarah has 2 children," Emma said quietly. "A boy and a girl. Michael has a son. You have 3 grandchildren you've never met." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd known, intellectually, that my children might have families of their own, but hearing it confirmed made the loss feel fresh and immediate. "Do you see them?" "Sometimes. We try to stay in touch, but it's complicated. They ask about you occasionally, but I think they've made peace with the way things are." Made peace, I repeated. That's one way to put it. Emma was quiet for a moment, then reached over and took my hand. It's not too late, Dad. It might be complicated, and it might be difficult, but it's not too late. I wanted to believe her, but the weight of years and pride and accumulated hurt felt insurmountable. How do you bridge a gap that's been 25 years in the making? How do you apologize for choices that seemed right at the time but caused so much pain? How do you admit that everything you thought you knew about love and family and faith might have been wrong? The days at Sunset Gardens blend together in ways that both comfort and disturb me. Breakfast at 8, medications at 9, physical therapy at 10, lunch at 12, afternoon activities that I mostly avoid, dinner at 6, and the long evening hours when memory becomes both blessing and curse. I've made few friends here, partly because of my natural reserve and partly because forming new relationships at my age feels like admitting this is truly the end of the story. But there's one man, Gerald Patterson, who's refused to let me retreat entirely into solitude. He's 81, a former teacher who lost his wife 3 years ago and whose children live too far away to visit regularly. Unlike me, he's maintained close relationships with his family despite the geographical distance, and he talks about his son in Brisbane and his daughter in Adelaide with a kind of pride and affection I once felt but somehow lost along the way. Gerald has noticed my isolation, the way I sit alone during meals and avoid the common areas where other residents gather to play cards or watch television. He's made it his mission to draw me out, stopping by my room to chat about current events or invite me to join him for walks around the facility's grounds. His persistence is both annoying and oddly comforting. "You know what your problem is, Bob," he said to me one afternoon as we sat in the garden watching new residents arrive with their anxious families. "You're living like a man who's already dead." I bristled at his directness. "I'm living like a man who's made peace with his circumstances." "Peace?" Gerald laughed, but not unkindly. "Is that what you call it? Looks more like surrender to me. When's the last time you talked to your children?" "It's complicated," I said, the standard response I'd been giving for years. "Everything worthwhile is complicated. That doesn't make it impossible." Gerald had a way of cutting through the careful distance I'd built around painful topics. Over the weeks that followed, he gradually drew out the story of my estrangement from Sarah and Michael, my regrets about the choices I'd made as their father, my fear that too much time had passed for any meaningful reconciliation. He listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me talk through decades of accumulated guilt and sorrow. "You were trying to save their souls," he said one evening as we sat in the common room after most of the other residents had gone to bed. "That's not nothing, Bob. Misguided maybe, but it came from love." "Did it?" I asked. "Or did it come from pride? From wanting to be right more than I wanted them to be happy?" "Maybe both," Gerald admitted. "But intentions matter, even when outcomes don't match what we hoped for. The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" The idea of reaching out to my children had been growing in the back of my mind for months, but Gerald's gentle pressure gave it new urgency. I began composing letters in my head during the long afternoon hours, imagining what I might say to bridge the gap between who I'd been and who I was becoming. But every draft felt inadequate, either too defensive or too self-pitying, too formal or too presumptuous. It was Gerald who suggested I start with just one of them, the one I felt closest to or most confident would respond positively. Without hesitation, I knew that would be Sarah. Despite all my failures as her father, there had always been something special between us, a connection that had survived even my worst attempts to control her life. She was the one who'd cared for Margaret during her illness, who'd shown grace under impossible circumstances, who'd inherited her mother's ability to love despite being hurt. I spent 3 weeks working on the letter, writing and rewriting, trying to find the right balance between honesty and hope. Gerald helped by reading drafts and pointing out where I sounded too proud or too apologetic, where I was making excuses instead of taking responsibility, where I was asking for too much too quickly. The final version was 2 pages long, handwritten on the good stationery Emma had bought me when I moved into Sunset Gardens. It began with an acknowledgement of the years that had passed and the pain I'd caused, moved through my regrets and realizations about my failures as a father, and ended with a simple request. Would she be willing to visit, just once, so I could apologize in person for the harm I'd done and tell her how proud I was of the woman she'd become? Mailing the letter was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. I walked to the facility's mailbox 3 times before I finally had the courage to drop it in, and even then I stood there for several minutes wondering if I should ask the staff to retrieve it. But Gerald was waiting for me when I returned, and the satisfied nod he gave me when I told him what I'd done convinced me I'd made the right choice. The waiting was agony. Days passed without any response, then weeks. I began to wonder if Sarah had even received the letter, if she'd moved and forgotten to forward her mail, if my words had somehow failed to convey what I'd intended. Gerald reminded me that 25 years of silence couldn't be overcome in a few days, that Sarah would need time to process what I'd written and decide how she wanted to respond. The letter came on a Thursday morning, delivered with the rest of my mail by Nurse Patricia, who seemed to understand its importance without being told. My hands shook as I opened it, and I had to read it 3 times before the words fully registered. "Dear Dad," it began, and just seeing that simple greeting after so many years of silence made my eyes fill with tears. "I received your letter, and I've been thinking about it for several days now. I appreciate your honesty and your willingness to acknowledge the pain our family has experienced. It takes courage to admit when we've been wrong, especially after so much time has passed. I won't pretend that your letter erases years of hurt or that forgiveness comes easily. But I also can't pretend that I don't miss having you in my life, despite everything that's happened between us. You're still my father, and that means something to me, even when our relationship has been difficult. I would like to visit you, not just once but regularly if things go well between us. I want you to meet David, my husband, and your grandchildren, Rebecca and James. They don't know much about you except that Grandpa Robert lives far away, but I think it's time they understood more about their family history. I can't speak for Michael or Emma, but I can tell you that we all talk about you more than you might think. We wonder how you're doing, whether you're happy, whether you ever think about us. Your letter answers some of those questions, and it gives me hope that maybe we can build something new together, even if we can't reclaim what we lost. I'll call the facility this weekend to arrange a visit. I'm looking forward to seeing you, Dad. It's been too long." The letter was signed simply Sarah, but at the bottom, in different handwriting, were 2 additional messages: "Can't wait to meet Grandpa, Rebecca," and "Love, James," in the careful script of a child just learning to write cursively. I cried then, sitting in my small room with Sarah's letter clutched in my hands, releasing decades of grief and regret and tentative hope. Gerald found me there an hour later, and when I showed him the letter, his own eyes grew moist with sympathetic joy. "Well," he said, clearing his throat gruffly, "I guess you'd better get ready to be a grandfather." The visit was scheduled for the following Saturday afternoon. I spent the entire week in preparation, asking the staff to help me get a proper haircut, pressing my best shirt, practicing conversations in my head. I was more nervous than I'd been in years, terrified that I would somehow say the wrong thing and undo this fragile opportunity for reconnection. Gerald helped me set up the facility's family meeting room, arranging chairs in a circle and making sure there were tissues and water glasses available. "Remember," he told me as we waited for Sarah to arrive, "this isn't about being perfect. It's about being real. They don't need you to have all the answers anymore. They just need you to care." When Sarah walked through the door, my first thought was how much she looked like Margaret at that age. She'd inherited her mother's gentle eyes and soft smile, but there was something stronger in her bearing now, a confidence that came from surviving difficult circumstances and building a life on her own terms. Behind her came a tall man with kind eyes who I knew must be David, and 2 children who looked at me with curious expressions that held no trace of the fear or resentment I'd expected. "Hello, Dad," Sarah said, and there was a slight tremor in her voice that told me she was as nervous as I was. "Hello, sweetheart," I replied, and the endearment slipped out before I could stop it, a remnant from when she was small and still trusted me completely. The conversation was awkward at first, full of careful topics and polite questions about health and weather and the facility's amenities. But gradually, as the afternoon progressed, we began to relax into something that felt more natural. David proved to be a gentle presence, asking thoughtful questions about my life and sharing stories about his work at the hospital. Rebecca, who was 12, had inherited the family tendency towards serious conversation, while 8-year-old James was more interested in exploring the meeting room and asking direct questions that made the adults laugh. "Why don't you live with Mommy and Daddy?" James asked at one point, climbing onto the chair next to mine with the fearless affection of a child who hadn't yet learned to guard his heart. "Well," I said, glancing at Sarah for guidance, "sometimes families live far apart, even when they love each other. And sometimes grandpas need special help when they get old, like I do here. But you could come visit us, Rebecca said practically. We have a guest room, and Mom makes really good pancakes. The simple invitation, offered with a child's assumption that love and proximity were natural partners, nearly undid me. I would like that very much, I managed to say. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and I found opportunities for private conversation while David entertained the children in the garden. It was during one of these moments that she asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you still believe, Dad? In the religion, I mean. In all the things you taught us when we were growing up. I considered deflecting, giving her the answer that would cause the least disruption, but Gerald's words about being real rather than perfect echoed in my mind. I don't know, I said honestly. I believe in God, and I believe in love, and I believe that forgiveness is possible even when we don't deserve it. But the rest of it? The rules and restrictions and the certainty that we had all the answers? I'm not sure about that anymore. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this admission. I'm glad, she said finally. Not that you're confused or hurting, but that you're questioning. It means you're still growing, still learning. I was afraid you might be too set in your ways to change. I've changed more than you know, I told her. Losing all of you, watching your mother die, seeing what my pride cost our family. It changes a person. I just hope I haven't changed too late. It's not too late, she said, echoing Emma's words from months earlier. It's complicated, and it won't happen overnight, but it's not too late. The visit lasted 4 hours, longer than I dared hope. When it was time for them to leave, Rebecca and James hugged me with the uninhibited affection of children who'd already accepted me as part of their world. David shook my hand warmly and mentioned specific plans for their next visit. And Sarah, after a moment's hesitation, wrapped me in a hug that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. I love you, Dad, she whispered in my ear. I always have, even when I couldn't show it. I love you too, sweetheart, I replied, and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything in my life. After they left, I sat in the meeting room for a long time, processing what had just happened. The years of separation hadn't disappeared, and the pain we'd caused each other hadn't been magically erased, but something had shifted. A door that had been closed for decades had opened just a crack, letting in enough light to see the possibility of a different kind of relationship. Gerald found me there as the sun was setting, painting the room in soft golden hues that seemed to match my mood. How did it go? He asked, though my expression had probably already given him the answer. Better than I had any right to expect, I said. She brought them, Gerald. My grandchildren. They're beautiful, and they're kind, and they want to know me. Of course they do, he said with satisfaction. Children always want to know where they came from, who their people are. You're part of their story, Bob, even if you've been missing from it for a while. The weeks that followed brought regular phone calls from Sarah and occasional conversations with Rebecca and James, who were fascinated by the idea of a grandfather they could talk to whenever they wanted. David sent me photos from Rebecca's school play and James's soccer games, including me in their family life in small but meaningful ways. Sarah and I began working through our shared history, talking about the good memories as well as the difficult ones, finding ways to acknowledge the past while building something new. It was Sarah who eventually reached out to Michael and Emma, sharing news of our reconciliation and encouraging them to consider their own relationships with me. The responses were mixed. Emma was cautiously optimistic, promising to visit during her next trip to Perth. Michael was more reserved, still carrying wounds that ran deep, but he agreed to a phone conversation that might lead to something more substantial. Those conversations haven't happened yet, but I'm learning to be patient in ways I never was when I was younger. Gerald reminds me regularly that healing takes time, that relationships are rebuilt slowly through consistent small actions rather than grand gestures. I'm trying to focus on what I can control. My own heart, my own choices, my own commitment to being the kind of father and grandfather my family deserves. Last month, Sarah brought the children for a weekend visit, staying in a nearby hotel but spending most of their time at Sunset Gardens. We had meals together in the dining room, where Rebecca charmed the other residents with her thoughtful questions and James made friends with everyone he met. I took them on walks around the facility's grounds, showed them the garden where I spend most of my quiet time, and told them stories about their grandmother that they'd never heard before. It was during that visit that Rebecca asked me about the photograph on my nightstand, the one picture I'd brought from the house that showed our family during what I'd thought were our happy years. Sarah was about 14 in the photo, Michael 12, Emma 6, all of them arranged formally in front of our Kingdom Hall after a circuit assembly. "You all look sad," Rebecca observed with the brutal honesty of a child. "Even though you're smiling." She was right, of course. Looking at that photograph now, I can see what I missed at the time. The tension in Sarah's shoulders, the forced quality of Michael's grin, the way Emma clings to Margaret's dress like an anchor. We looked like a perfect Jehovah's Witness family, but we were already fracturing under the weight of my expectations. "We were trying very hard to be good," I told Rebecca. "Sometimes when you try too hard to be perfect, you forget to be happy." "That's silly," James said with 8-year-old logic. "You should just be good and happy." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "I wish I had figured that out sooner." These conversations with my grandchildren have become some of the most meaningful exchanges of my later years. They ask questions without agenda, accept answers without judgment, and offer affection without conditions. Through them, I'm learning what unconditional love actually looks like, how it differs from the demanding, performance-based love I once thought was spiritual faithfulness. Yesterday, Sarah called with news that has filled me with more hope than I've felt in decades. Michael has agreed to visit next month, bringing his wife and son for a long weekend. It will be the first time I've seen him in over 20 years, and I have no idea what to expect. Sarah warned me that he's still angry, still processing the impact of our family's dysfunction on his own life and relationships. But he's willing to try, and that's more than I thought I would ever receive. Emma has also scheduled a visit for next spring, planning to spend a full week in Perth so we can have extended time together. She's become a successful therapist, working with families in crisis, and I suspect her professional training has given her insights into our own family dynamics that might be difficult for me to hear. But I'm ready to listen now in ways I never was before, ready to accept responsibility for the damage my pride and rigidity caused. As I write this, sitting in the garden where Margaret's roses have somehow taken root despite the institutional setting, I find myself thinking about the nature of time and redemption. For most of my adult life, I believed that truth was fixed and unchanging, that once you found the right path, you simply had to walk it without deviation. I thought questioning was weakness, that doubt was dangerous, that love required total compliance with external standards. Now I understand that truth is more like these roses. It needs room to grow, requires patient tending, and flourishes best when given freedom to reach toward light in its own unique way. The love I thought I was showing my children was actually a kind of spiritual violence, pruning away parts of their authentic selves in service of an ideal that had more to do with my own need for control than with their well-being. I can't undo the years of separation or erase the pain I caused by putting religious compliance before familial love. But I can choose, even at 83, to become someone worthy of the forgiveness my children are offering. I can learn to listen without defending, to apologize without making excuses, to love without conditions. Gerald tells me that redemption stories are his favorite kind, that there's something particularly powerful about people who find the courage to change course late in life. "You're not the same man who raised those children," he reminded me last week. "Don't expect them to respond to you as if you were." He's right, of course. I'm not the rigid elder who prioritized organizational loyalty over family harmony. I'm not the father who valued compliance more than connection. The process of losing everything I thought mattered, my position in the congregation, my certainty about truth, my relationships with my children, has stripped away layers of false identity and revealed something more essential underneath. I am simply Robert Maxwell, an old man who made serious mistakes but is grateful for the opportunity to make amends. I am a father who finally understands that love means accepting people as they are, not demanding they become who we think they should be. I am a grandfather who wants to offer his grandchildren the kind of unconditional affection he failed to give his own children. The other residents here at Sunset Gardens sometimes ask me about my family, having noticed the increased number of phone calls and visits I've been receiving. I tell them about Sarah and David, about Rebecca and James, about the possibility of reconnecting with Michael and Emma. They listen with the wistful attention of people who understand how precious family connections become when you're approaching the end of life's journey. But I also share my story as a cautionary tale, hoping that others might learn from my mistakes. Too many of us, I think, sacrifice present happiness for future perfection, trading authentic relationships for ideological purity. We convince ourselves that we're protecting the people we love when we're actually controlling them, that we're serving God when we're really serving our own need to be right. The path back to my children has been longer and more difficult than I ever imagined it could be, but it has also been more rewarding than I dared hope. Every phone call with Sarah, every drawing Rebecca sends me, every shy smile from James represents a small miracle of grace that I know I don't deserve but am grateful to receive. Next week, Sarah is bringing the children for another visit, and this time Emma will join us. It will be the first time in 25 years that two of my children will be in the same room with me, and I can hardly imagine what that will feel like. We've planned to look through old photo albums together, to share memories both difficult and beautiful, to begin weaving a new family narrative that acknowledges the past while embracing the possibility of a different future. I know that some relationships are too damaged to fully repair, that some mistakes leave permanent scars, that forgiveness doesn't always lead to restoration. But I also know that love is stronger than pride, that grace can reach across decades of silence, that it's never too late to become the person your family needs you to be. If I could speak to my younger self, the proud elder who thought he had all the answers, I would tell him to hold his children more and judge them less. I would tell him that questions are not threats to faith but invitations to deeper understanding. I would tell him that a family's love is more precious than a congregation's approval, that authenticity matters more than appearance, that mercy is always more powerful than rigid adherence to rules. But I cannot speak to that younger man. I can only be who I am now, in this moment, with whatever time I have remaining. I can love my children and grandchildren without conditions. I can listen to their stories without trying to rewrite them. I can offer them the grandfather they deserve, even if I failed to be the father they needed. As the sun sets over Perth and the evening shift begins their rounds at Sunset Gardens, I close this account with gratitude rather than regret. Gratitude for children who found the courage to forgive. Gratitude for grandchildren who love me before they even knew me. Gratitude for Gerald, who pushed me toward redemption when I was content with isolation. And gratitude for the hard-won wisdom that love, real love, always includes the freedom to choose your own path toward truth. The Maxwell family is being rebuilt, slowly and carefully, on a foundation of grace rather than law. It may not look like the perfect family portrait I once thought I wanted, but it's real in ways that manufactured perfection never could be. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. The chance to love and be loved authentically, without pretense or condition, for exactly who we are. Tomorrow Sarah will call, as she does every Sunday evening. Rebecca and James will tell me about their week at school, David will update me on his work at the hospital, and Sarah will remind me that I'm always welcome in their home. These conversations, which once seemed impossible, have become the highlight of my days and the source of hope that carries me through the difficult ones. I am 83 years old, a grandfather I'm still learning how to be, a father who finally understands what love actually means. It's not the ending I planned for my life, but it's better than the one I thought I deserved. And in this place where endings usually feel like defeat, my story is somehow just beginning. The roses Margaret planted are blooming again, and my family is coming home.